first talk today is over my most recent book. This is what it looks like. It's over here. It's titled Scripture's Hidden Hyperlinks, How the Bible Clicks. But before we get into this and what I'm talking about, we're going to play a little game. Hopefully it'll be kind of fun, just to demonstrate the point. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to say some phrases. We're going to take one at a time. And I want all of you to blurt out, oh, they're coming in. I'm going to say some phrases that we're probably all going to be familiar with. And I want all of you, not in turn, just blurt out everything that you think of. And I mean everything. Any and all things that enter your mind when I say these simple, short phrases, okay? First off, 77 years ago. Okay. Okay, what else?
What'd you say?
What else? 77 years ago. Good? Good. So we got Lincoln, Gettysburg, Civil War. What else?
Shortest speech.
Okay. Yep, we had Lincoln. What else? Think beyond this. Think about anything that comes to mind at all.
Civil War.
Yep. Have that. Good. Emancipation, slavery, forefathers. What else? Good. You think of Lincoln, you know the famous story about him writing the whole speech, which is pretty short as speeches go, but he wrote it on a train ride to Gettysburg. You know, I think about having to memorize the Gettysburg Address. Well, not having to, but doing it for extra credit. And I think the 8th grade. I remember how proud my dad was when I memorized the speech in like 2 hours, you know. But there's a lot that comes to mind, right? You might think of the movie Gone with the Wind. So it takes place during the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
Another famous line, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, right? Okay. Next one. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What do you think of? Okay, we think of the rest of the passage, right? What else? Constitution. Founding Fathers. What else?
Revolution.
The Revolution. Okay, so you're going to think of England, King George, right? Good. And when we talk about the forefathers, we think about specific historical figures, right? Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Adams, George Washington, which might make me think of Mount Vernon, Monticello, right? There's a whole host of things that come to mind, isn't there? Okay, next one. Most of you should know this. Here I stand, I can do no other.
Martin Luther.
Yes. At the Diet of Worms.
Oh, that's right.
What does that make you think of? Beyond Martin Luther and the excommunication. Good. Good. Maybe the time period. Yep.
99.
Good. Good. Yep. Okay. There's a lot we think of, right? And it can go way beyond just a phrase. Next one. May the force be with you.
Star Wars.
Good. Okay. Now, what do you think of when you think of Star Wars?
Oh, I love Star Wars.
Yeah. A lot of people do. What do you think of Comic-Con? The fact that they're like the Marvel series, they're never going to stop making Star Wars movies. Right? What else? What else do you think of? Good. Luke Skywalker. Who else? Darth Vader.
Nerds.
Yoda. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Obi-Wan. Okay. There's a lot. Good. Now, think of, and you know, we just barely scratched the surface with these examples, right? And if we were to take this further, we would see just how much we really think of. It just goes further and further out, doesn't it?
Yes.
We just dive deeper and deeper and deeper. And it may recall memories of, you know, when I think of Star Wars, I remember my dad saying that he watched the movies in the theater and he was shocked about Darth Vader being Luke's father, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I think about that. I think about a story of my dad. It has nothing to do really with the movies, but it does, right? It's all interconnected. Okay, so here's the point. When something has been deeply ingrained in us, it takes only a few words, just a short line to open up an entire web of knowledge, meaning, and context. It's how things work, right? in literature, in our understanding. This is exactly how the scriptures were learned and communicated in ancient times. The vast majority of Israelites and all ancient groups of people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. So everything had to be communicated orally and many, many times, and memorization was key. In fact, ancient Israelites ended up, especially around the time of Christ, his ministry on earth, they had vast passages and portions of scripture, the law, the Psalms, and the prophets, completely committed word for word, verbatim, to memory. And what's interesting is they also didn't have chapter and verse numbers like we do now, making memorization all the more important. So rabbis taught this way. This is the one phrase I haven't written up here yet, using a primary method known in Hebrew as Remez. And Remez simply means hint. Okay? So rather than citing an entire passage, a rabbi, and Jesus taught as a rabbi, he was a Jew who taught as a master teacher. He used Remez all the time. And this was the primary method that rabbis used to teach. Okay, they would state the first couple or few words of the opening line of a psalm or of a prophetic passage or from the Torah, from the Pentateuch, the law. And their hearers, because they had been taught and memorized this over many years and heard it hundreds of times, they would instantly recall the entire passage, just like what we did. Okay, now today, the need for memorization has practically gone out the window. We have the internet, okay? So we use today what we call hyperlinks, hence the title of the book and the talk, right? So what do? We go to a website, we're researching a topic, and we click a link, a hyperlink, right? So a hyperlink means that we're clicking to another site that contains more, even deeper, often, content. From there, we click another hyperlink that delves even deeper and takes us into even more information. If you're like me, when you research a topic online, you just go down a rabbit hole, right? You just keep clicking the links and then going back, and before long, you try and memorize as much as you can. And it's really a shame, isn't it, that memorization has kind of gone by the wayside. Because the more important the truth is, the more important it is that we have it memorized and committed to memory, especially if we're going to be trying to teach others, right? So we might look at this method and say, wow, that's old-fashioned. And these poor people, they had to listen to everything. They had to learn it all orally and commit it all to memory. Don't feel bad for them. Feel bad for us, right? Because we should be doing that more often. And many of us do. We do have many passages committed to memory. And now we've got a lot of versions. So, we have the benefit of being able to go and dig even deeper into the context, especially with tools like a concordance, right? And different Bible versions. And we can see how words were translated in proper context. So we use hyperlinks today. They function just like Romez did among Israel and the early believers. But that whole system allows you to just dig deeper. Now, this is crucial when it comes to studying the Bible, because we'll unavoidably miss things, important things, and take them out of context if we don't recognize the use of Remez, hinting, the hyperlinks within the text, and learn to read and interpret Scripture the way Christ, the apostles, and the early believers did. Okay, so Remez was really the dominant form of teaching, but we have a couple others as well. You'll see them written up here. So mashal in Hebrew is a word that means parable, story, or simile. Jesus taught this way often. The kingdom of heaven is like a sower went out to sow. living water will flow from within. Right? Sounds a little confusing to us, but to early believers, they recognized every one of those lines as a form of a hyperlink, right? Connecting to something else, usually that had been taught and well learned and memorized from the Hebrew scriptures. Now, while not a hyperlink per se, mashal often depends on what we could call scriptural echoes. Another method is gezerah shavah. And this is a term that refers to linking passages that share a similar, unique word or phrase. So this law of interpretation states that if two passages or more share an unusual word or phrase, they can often interpret each other. Now, Paul used this constantly. For example, he quoted Habakkuk 2:4, which says, "The righteous shall live by faith." Raise your hand if you've heard that phrase. Were you aware that it was even from Habakkuk? Yeah, but Paul uses it several times. In Galatians 3, he uses it when describing law versus faith. In Romans 1:17, he quotes it. And in Hebrews 10, it's used in a perseverance context. So we see one little phrase becomes a hub, linking multiple theological points across different books, different passages, and different, sometimes pretty vast, time periods. This is how early believers understood the text, and it's something we have mostly lost. Now, not surprisingly, Jesus was the master hyperlinker. And he taught, again, as a Jewish rabbi, knowing his listeners knew the scriptures thoroughly. He often quoted partial lines, echoed existing stories, reenacted Old Testament stories and scenes. By the way, it's important when we use phrases, we all know this, but we use phrases like stories, characters. They're real, right? We hear a word like story and we think of a bedtime story. You think, oh, this is just something fiction. No, we're talking about real events. So don't misunderstand when I say a biblical story. When I say a biblical character, I'm talking about real people, right? We get that. Okay. Did you know Jesus reenacted these scenes for others and among his disciples on occasion? He often used imagery to trigger memory. And most importantly, he positioned himself within Israel's story. Okay? Raise your hand if you knew that. This is going to be kind of an interactive talk, guys. So I want you to, okay. So no hands raised there. So either you're just shy or we don't understand that Jesus was positioning himself as the Messiah of Israel within their story. And there are many examples of this. Jesus, well, Mary and Joseph fleeing to take Jesus away from King Herod the Great because he feared that his throne was going to be taken over by the prophesied king of the Jews. That echoes perfectly Moses' escape in the basket in Egypt. Jesus' 40 days in the desert right before his temptation perfectly echoes Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. His baptism echoes Israel going through the Red Sea. The Sermon on the Mount echoes Moses on Mount Sinai. And the much greater deliverance, this is key, that Christ provides to all perfectly echoes the amazing Exodus story of the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt under Moses. So these are just a few examples, but it's interesting. The entire book of Matthew, in particular, when understood through the use of its numerous hyperlinks, is clearly a depiction of Christ as the greater Moses and the true Israel. Now, how many of you, and I didn't know this until not long ago, how many of you have read the book of Matthew before and understood it easily as a perfect allusion back to the Exodus story in Moses? But you know what? An early believer would have caught it pretty easily. Okay. Now there's some There are some allusions and echoes in the text that are pretty clear. It would have especially been to an ancient believer. And there are some that are a little more cryptic and not so easy. So again, you have to dig deep, right? And they did too to a point, but we have to dig even deeper. So it's important to know Jesus didn't proof text. Who knows what proof texting is? Joe? Yeah. Yep. Okay. So proof texting is taking an isolated passage or a point out of context to try and make a point and prove something, right? Not a good idea. We need the entire context to come to the true meaning behind the truth, don't we? Okay, so Jesus did not proof text. What he did was he activated Scripture within his hearers. He made it come alive. And this is part of why, beyond, of course, his miracles, the obvious signs, was part of why Jesus garnered so much attention pretty early on in his ministry and got such a loyal following. Okay, imagine listening to something and instead of it just being the same trite, mundane words and phrases used over and over again being preached to you, the scriptures are coming alive. You feel like you're living within the text. That's power, right? That's exactly what Jesus did. Now, by far, the single most important hyperlink, get ready, Mike. I asked Mike to do me a favor here. The most important hyperlink in all of Scripture for us to be familiar with is Jesus' cry from the cross, which is recounted in Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34. What did he say? He said a few things, but yes, my God, why hast thou, or why have you forsaken me? We hear that. What do we think? What do we think happened? Naturally. God forsook his own perfect son while he's dying, right? Now, I thought this my whole life, really. I mean, until, again, fairly recently when I started to understand Remez and scriptural hyperlinks. But here's what we learn. Guess what those few words are actually referring to? Anyone know? Psalm 22. Mike, you got it?
To the choir master, a psalm of David. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Good.
Why are you so far from saving me?
That's the first line to Psalm 22. Now, read the end of the passage. Just a little bit toward the end.
All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations.
Good. So, the psalm starts with presumed forsakenness, right?
Yeah.
And it ends with glory. So, those who were in the know and listening to Christ's cry from Calvary, and everyone who read the words from Matthew and Mark recounting this event afterwards, would have instantly recognized it as the opening line to Psalm. They would have seen that Christ was using Remez, Hebrew scriptural hinting, that form of teaching, to recall the entire Psalm. So let's go over what that Psalm is all about. It opens with apparent despair. It goes on to talk about a righteous sufferer who's mocked, who has crushed bones, pierced hands and feet, the dividing of garments, but it ends with divine deliverance of that righteous sufferer and the ultimate triumph of God that reaches all nations. Yeah. So Jesus wasn't, again, he wasn't proof texting. He wasn't picking out a singular line to supposedly convey that his father's forsaking him. He's pointing all of his hearers and future readers who get this to Psalm 22 and recalling the entire passage. And you know what he's saying? He's saying, I am the righteous sufferer of Psalm 22, who will be vindicated and my loving Father has not forsaken me. He's actually saying the exact opposite of what we assume he's saying. So that's arguably the most important hyperlink in the Bible to get. But there are many others that are very interesting and crucial. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, described in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, is far from just a private spiritual battle. It's a deliberate retelling of Israel's wilderness narratives where they continually failed and he overcame every challenge. In fact, every one of Jesus' responses to Satan during the temptation is a direct quotation from Deuteronomy. Do you know that? Man shall not live by bread alone, directly from Deuteronomy 8. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test, from Deuteronomy 6. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Also, Deuteronomy 6. So taken together, these hyperlinks show Jesus reliving Israel's story, but succeeding everywhere they failed. Again, Matthew presents him as the greater Moses and the true Israel, their Messiah. On 2 occasions, when accused of associating with sinners in Matthew 9:13, and when his disciples were challenged for plucking grain on the Sabbath in Matthew 12:7, a few short chapters later, Jesus quoted a single line from Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, to recall the entire prophetic accusation against ritual without heart. So when you read Hosea 6, it contains a strong critique of shallow religiosity. And by hyperlinking the passage to the accusers, Jesus challenged the Pharisees and religious leaders' interpretation of righteousness. They valued ritual precision based in man-made traditions rather than God's actual laws at the time for them, whereas Jesus emphasized mercy, compassion, and for them, covenant faithfulness. The point they needed to hear was that genuine love for God and their neighbor, the greatest command, was superior to all ritualistic practice and had to be placed above religious ritual. Okay, next one. In Luke 4, Jesus reads from Isaiah 61 in the synagogue of Nazareth, his hometown. This one's big. He reads only the first part of the passage, enough to identify the work of God's anointed servant. Then he stops and he says, what? Today in your hearing, the scripture is fulfilled. Now, this is a powerful hyperlink and crucial to understand because Isaiah 61 promises good news to the poor, healing for the brokenhearted, liberation for captives, comfort for mourners, and the rebuilding of ancient ruins. It's saturated with images of jubilee and ultimate freedom. But Jesus selectively reads only the first portion of the passage, and that's deliberate. He reads up to, but not including the phrase, and the day of vengeance of our God. Now, everyone hearing him, and then hearing him right after say, today in your hearing the scriptures fulfilled, they know the whole passage. They've heard it hundreds of times, and they have it completely committed to memory. So they're confused. They understand, okay, this guy is claiming, this guy from Nazareth, this nobody, is claiming to be our Messiah. Apparently, that's why right afterwards they tried to stone him, right? They get it because they understood the hyperlinks. But what Jesus was conveying was my current mission, my purpose here now is not the complete passage, right? It doesn't yet involve judgment. In Matthew 21, Jesus quotes Psalm 118:22, which says, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. You heard that? And he does it to demonstrate to Israel's religious leaders that they are the ones rejecting the one, him, who is the true cornerstone. How could they understand that without knowing the hyperlink? They got it because they knew the passage well. At the Last Supper, this is a good one. Jesus quotes Zechariah 13:7, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered," to his disciples. This passage, which again they knew very well, describes a time of refining, purification, and preparation. Contrary to what we might think when we read the passage, he wasn't scolding them. He was preparing them by reminding them that the ensuing events, which were going to be very hard, were not random. They were part of God's greater perfect plan. But if we don't see the hyperlink, we naturally assume that he's rebuking his disciples during their last intimate moment together. When we see the link, when we click it, we get he's comforting them. And they understood that. So we've talked some about the gospel writers, in particular Matthew and Mark, a decent bit, but all the gospel writers were experts with hyperlinks, of course. So we talked about the relationship between Matthew and Moses in the Exodus story. A couple other interesting points. Luke is deeply shaped by Old Testament models, particularly the stories of Samuel, David, Elijah, Elisha, Elijah's successor, and Isaiah. John hyperlinks several times to Genesis, Exodus, and the temple. So we have to remember, these were Jewish men who knew the scriptures in and out, mostly because of Remez, this form of teaching, and they knew their audience would naturally see the parallels. It's just much more difficult for us today because we weren't taught that way. So I want to take a moment and pause and ask all of you, again, I mean, we've already done this to a point, but just raise your hands for me if you've ever noticed pretty easily or clearly any parallels between the New Testament, Greek scriptures, and many in the Old. This is broad, okay? Good?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And we've all probably seen some, but have you seen it to this extent? Okay. Raise your hand if you knew that Jesus' cry from the cross was actually a hint for the entire psalm in Psalm 22. Yeah, okay, a handful of people, good. Now to Paul. Paul is without doubt the most sophisticated interpreter of scripture in the Greek scriptures. And it didn't hurt that prior to his conversion, he was well trained as a Pharisee and shaped by the traditions of Second Temple Judaism. I'm going to have to get through this part quickly, but in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, he links new creation to Adam in Genesis. In Galatians 3 and Romans 4, he links justification back to Abraham. In Romans 10, he speaks of the word being near you, in your mouth and in your heart, hyperlinking to Moses' last sermon in Deuteronomy 30, in particular verse 14. In Galatians 4, he invokes the story of Sarah and Hagar, Abraham's wife and concubine, as an allegory for freedom versus slavery. The list goes on, but you get the idea. Now, Hebrews, likely also written by Paul, is the most hyperlinked book in the entire Bible. There are many links that we could go over, but most of them allude to the priesthood, the tabernacle, sacrifices, covenant rituals, the wilderness generation, the temple structure, and Yom Kippur, the so-called Day of Atonement. Revelation, the unveiling. This one's especially interesting. We all know how difficult Revelation is, right? But while Revelation doesn't contain a single word-for-word hyperlink, like a lot of other books, it contains over 600 allusions to other books in Scripture, making it the most intertextually saturated book in the entire Bible.
You said Revelation?
Yes, Revelation. And when you see the allusions and form of hyperlinks, it makes it much more easy to understand. It's also important, this is key to understanding Revelation, that this is a book written to Israel.
Right.
This is not a book written to us. Okay, so the point is, biblical hyperlinks are not merely an academic curiosity. They are key to reading scripture the way Jesus, the apostles, and early believers did. How can we do this? How can we open these links? Number one, look for Old Testament quotations and partial phrases. This, of course, requires studying the Hebrew scriptures to a point. Number two, identify repeating imagery. Number three, trace narrative patterns, storytelling. Number 4, take note of rare or unusual words. Number 5, pay close attention to emotion and tone. And number 6, read horizontally, meaning compare Scripture with Scripture. The Bible does interpret itself, but we won't see where and how without clicking through its hyperlinks.
There you go.